Bonjour à tous, bienvenue pour cette deuxième journée de colloque et cette deuxième conférence inaugurale. It's my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Anatoliy Gruzd. He's a Canada researcher in social media data stewardship and associate professor at the Ted Rogers School of Management at Ryerson University. Anatoliy has been a leader in social media studies and established the first social media research laboratory in North America. He also co-founded the annual international conference on social media and society. Anatoliy studies how social media platforms are changing the way in which people and organizations communicate, share information, conduct business, and form communities, and how this change impacts society. Anatoliy and his team at the Social Media Lab also developed new analytical tools and approach for discovering and visualizing social media data and online networks. The broad aim of this research initiative is to advance the public's understanding of the benefits and pitfalls of social media adoption. So, let's do it.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. Let's talk about the state of social media research after the Cambridge Analytica scandal. And as all of you probably know, the scandal happened earlier this year when Facebook discovered that the user data, including friends or friends data, was essentially acquired without explicit user permission and used for targeted political acts. So we will talk about implications of this scandal on us who are doing social media research, working with social media data, but we'll also talk about other challenges, such as the rise of social bots and cyber, how those type of accounts may influence in our data sets and our analysis. We'll also conclude the presentation just generally talking about ethics and what ethical implications and considerations should we have when working with social media data. So let's begin. And before we start, I guess I will share a link to the slide deck in case you want to follow it on your own computers. I included a number of hyperlinks that might be useful for you. So it's a bit.ly/SM state 18. So I'll give you a second to write it down. So it's bit.ly/SM state 18. What is interesting that despite the rising and growing privacy concerns, people are still turning to social media to find friends, to connect with loved ones, to entertain themselves, access news, share information. And in Canada, for example, over 90% of us are using social media for some purposes. For example, 84% of internet users here have a Facebook account, 59% have YouTube account, and this is based on some of the recent survey that we've conducted in the Social Media Lab. When we are using social media accounts, we go there, we post, we share, we like, we click, we comment on, and all of these interactions essentially are being recorded and stored by different platforms, and then made available to third parties through convenient automated ways such as APIs. And so one of my research interests is to examine the practices behind using social media data. So how third parties, such as researchers, but also others, using such social media data, for what purposes, and what are the guiding principles they apply when they are collecting and analyzing social media data. And this is an interdisciplinary kind of research problem, and it requires a common framework to understand all different stakeholders and processes. And for that, I'm turning to a kind of concept called data stewardship. So many of you here are probably familiar with it, but just briefly, essentially the data stewardship or data curation comes from the library and information science field, and it was often applied to kind of understand processes behind managing scientific data, usually in lab environment, where researchers would generate their own data and manage it. And it's quite common in hard sciences, which is less common in social sciences and humanities. So what I'm arguing that this is a useful concept to also apply to social media data, but we need to kind of conceptualize it, because social media data is somewhat different from data generated in a lab. First of all, it's inherently social because it's created by users, not researchers. But there is also additional complexity. That is, platforms such as Facebook, Twitter are managing and curating this data for users. So essentially, you have much more, high number of stakeholders involved on the data consumer and data production side, and you have these intermediaries such as platforms to navigate through. So in the nutshell, essentially, when we say social media data stewardship, what we mean is we want to examine all different stages of managing social media data, from data collection to analysis, publication, reviews, and publishing. And to introduce you to this concept, and as well as talk about different challenges associated with each of these steps, especially in light of Cambridge Analytica scandal, let's walk through most of these steps and look at some of the specific examples. And collection, of course, is number one step, because before we start research, we need some data to work with. There are three common ways to collect social media data. So APIs, application programmable interfaces, are the most popular and common way to collect social media, at least for now. These are the mechanisms that platforms would develop themselves to offer third-party developers an easy and automated way to access their platform. And so in return, the hope that those developers will develop cool apps and enrich the experience of users in those platforms. The other way to access data, social media data, is through data resellers. So you have companies like Gnib, DataSift, essentially offering an opportunity to buy access to data for different social media platforms, or access to analytics. And then you have, of course, data that researchers themselves may collect by developing their own apps, or asking users to install Chrome extensions or similar devices to kind of collect the observed data through their browsers or other tools. So what happened since the Cambridge Analytica scandal earlier this year is that Facebook, for example, has been really reconsidering what they're willing to share with third-party applications, including us researchers. For example, in April of this year, they shut down the access to the public groups API. Essentially, researchers who are looking at online communities and want to see, analyze public Facebook groups, they currently don't have access to automatically collect conversational data from those groups. They also introduce other changes to their platform. For example, when you still can collect public pages and comments on those pages, but the platform will limit the number of metadata fields associated with this type of data. Instagram, also owned by Facebook, announced phasing out their current API that many researchers also relied on to understand the engagement on Instagrams, to collect public information about public posts and comments. It no longer offers access to public comments. There's still some access to public posts, but that will be shut down in December. So just 2 months left if you want to do this type of research. Twitter has been still, the most kind of generous in terms of providing access to their data, but we'll see if that may change in the future. So earlier this summer, during the International Conference on Social Media and Society, we had a very active discussion about, what's happening, how, computational social sciences will deal with this issue of lack of data access to study this, popular phenomenon. So some felt that perhaps going back to web scraping will be the way. I'm not quite sure. This is essentially the way that existed pre-social media, when you have a script that just visit a web page and automatically grabs all the HTML from those pages. I personally have concerns that there may be additional ethical implications that will happen when you're scraping social data. So that's why I put a big question mark next to it. But regardless of my concerns, I think that some of it will still be happening due to the lack of more transparent kind of way to collect social media data. But okay, let's put all the challenges of collecting social media data aside, and let's say you have a social media data set that you either collected before these changes took in effect, or you were fortunate to get it through other sources. What do you do with it? So we assume that it's going to be a large-scale data set. It will be perhaps multidimensional. You have multiple data points, metadata elements involved, and so that will be classified as big data. And so fortunately, we have quite a few different big data technologies that are available to us to store it through distributed cloud computing storage, NoSQL databases, and we have quite a few products kind of in the area of data science that allows us to quickly parse and analyze text and networks available to us. And there's a wide range of tools under this analytics section where you might have some computing, programming background that require you to use Python and R libraries. There are quite a few of those out there for data scientists, but there are also a lot of web-based applications available. And many of them will have a visual analytics component as a way to kind of explore your data set. Because of the size of it, of course, visual analytics will help you to quickly zoom in on particular data points. So that's kind of a good side that we still have the technology available to us. If you don't have programming skills, in the lab, we've been tracking, kind of compiling a list of similar tools that allows you to do social media research without knowledge necessarily of programming knowledge. So there is a link in the slide, and if you didn't capture the slide deck earlier, I'm happy to share it later. And essentially, the idea to place the tool on this list if it has some kind of peer review publication associated with it. That's the kind of criteria to be included in this list. So let's say we figure out the technology, we got the data, now we want to analyze it. But there has been a lot of discussions what to do with bots and cyber accounts that may be present in your data set. And there's a sense that there's a growing percentage of accounts are created automatically, and they might be kind of creating noise in your data. Of course, it's not a problem if you're a subject of research, if you study in bots, if you want to analyze their behavior and how they interact with other accounts. But it may be a problem if you're trying to kind of extrapolate some of your analysis to general public or even just social media users, but real people, not automated accounts. So that kind of raises the question of who are we studying, bots or humans? To give you an example, I did some quick analysis this week with the data set that Twitter just released last week. And so essentially what they did, they published a data set of tweets, about 9 million tweets that they say associated with accounts created by Internet Research Agency in Russia. And the time range that the data covers is from 2011 to 2018. So what you see on this slide essentially is a number of tweets over time, showing that these accounts actually were tweeting and retweeting way before the 2016 US election. So that was an interesting point right there and then. But I wanted to go deeper and see how this automatically created account, the bots and cyborgs, engaged on Twitter and with other social media users. So kind of to get a sense how they might be influencing data set that we're analyzing. Let's say if you are analyzing US election, 2016 US election. So I took this time period 1 month before the 2016 US election, and it turned out to be about 200,000 tweets and retweets by these accounts. And I created a network. So let me just quickly tell you what you see in here. It's a communication network where each node is a Twitter account. And I use different colors to represent different accounts types. So we have a list of known, or at least according to Twitter, accounts that are associated with Internet Research Agency. And so I use red color for them. So these are the red dots that all over this map. And the green color nodes, in the nodes that these bots or cyborgs engaged with, mention or retweet the content. And you can see that red dots are throughout of this network. And what was also interesting, that they kind of clustered around different areas, suggesting that there are different bots, different accounts that were associated with different types of discussions. So it's not like all of them engage in all of the conversations, but you have a cluster. You probably don't see it on top right corner. There are big accounts called Real Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton. So those accounts are engaged with the political discussions in the US directly. But there are other clusters down below and other ones. They talk about different topics. For example, the conflict between Ukraine and Russia. So certainly what it tells us that the bots are there. They are in our data sets if we are using social media to make conclusions and about certain aspects of our society and our discourse. And also we have to kind of realize how they might be influencing this, the information dissemination flow as well. So it's still a big problem. It's still an ongoing problem. There's no clear solution. There are some tools that can help us identify accounts as bots or not. Most of them were kind of trained and designed for Twitter, again, likely because of easy access to this platform. Here's an example tool, Barometer, essentially a tool allows you to check the likelihood that a particular account is a bot or not based on their tweeting behavior, based on their content, who they associated, and so on. It's really trained for political bots, so if you study in other topics, it's probably not the best tool for you, but you can try it out. There's also API where you can send a list of Twitter users to this platform, and they will return the scores, the likelihood scores, those accounts, whether they are bots or not. So it allows you to do somewhat large-scale analysis with your data sets. All right, so so far we talked about collection of social media data, analysis of social media data, and let's talk about some of the challenges associated with publishing, reusing, and preserving social media data sets. And I think this topic should be quite close to many of you in digital humanities here as well. Even if you're not working with social media data sets, the same principles, or we hope the same principles, should apply to social media data sets. But unfortunately, they're not. And in part because terms of service of each of different social media platforms that essentially provide you access to some form of version of their data, they disallow even researchers to actively share or publish their data sets. And it's been a problem for years for us in academia because it kind of limits the opportunity to validate previous studies, to replicate previous research, and really limits our opportunity to collaborate. It's generally acceptable, even though I don't know if you didn't test it anywhere, that researchers in the same group or even within the same university can work and analyze the same social media data sets. But if you want to share it on a website or with colleagues at a different university, that would be problematic. Again, because Twitter datasets have been most actively used because of the access, there has been a lot of experiments as well as discussions with Twitter what can or cannot be done with their datasets. And so I'm going to use Twitter as an example of how can you share a dataset related to your study, but then I'm going to turn around and talk about challenges with even that schema. So let's say you're collecting tweets on a particular subject matter, and you're using platforms like Social Feed Manager. And there are other platforms from that list I mentioned earlier, but this is a nice data collector for Twitter and some other platforms. So you've collected the tweets, and then you want to share it and publish it with your paper. Well, you can't, but what you can do, according to Twitter platform, you can extract all the identifiers, so tweet IDs, from your data set, and you can publish the list of Twitter IDs. So essentially, instead of the actual message, there will be a unique identifier associated that Twitter assigned to that message, and it's persistent. So you publish that list. Earlier Twitter was trying to also make changes even to that schema by saying, well, you can only share, 1 million or so Twitter IDs. And so academics really weren't happy with it, and so likely Twitter went back and stopped that artificial threshold. Because most of our data set, really, if you study in the global phenomena and elections, they would include more than 1 million tweets. So as a result, there are different catalogs right now, and if you're working with data-verse installations, the data repositories, you can find some of these tweet ID data sets around different topics. You can download it, but you're not going to see the tweets. So what's the use for them, right? Well, what you need to do then, you have to have another application that will use the list of Twitter IDs as an input, and it will go back to Twitter using Twitter API and say, hey, give me the original tweets. So you have to recollect all of the tweets again. So luckily there's applications like Hydrator, so hydrating meaning like adding the content back to the tweet, that quickly takes your list of IDs and goes to Twitter. It may take a while, but it does it automatically, so you can keep running on your computer. There are some R libraries to do that as well. The issue here, so that's a good thing, that there is a mechanism, there are tools that allows us to share a version of your data set and then other can recollect it. The challenge is that when another person who wants to use your data set will recollect the tweets, some of the tweets by then will be deleted by the users or by the platform, and maybe some users are blocked, so you won't be able to get all of the original tweets likely. And in our experiments, generic data set, you will lose about 20% of your data easily. And so what happens essentially, you still cannot replicate the previous study because you are now working with a kind of curated version of the original data set. And it's kind of Twitter trying to respect the user's wishes. If they deleted data, they say it should be deleted across all of the data sets out there. But at the same time, it creates challenges for researchers who want to study the events as they actually happened, especially when we're talking about information and manipulation campaigns in the context of different elections. Because once those accounts, such as bots that we talked about earlier, created by Internet Research Agency, removed from the dataset, you don't really know the actual impact if you try to go back and recollect some of these messages. So these are the challenges. Still not a lot of answers, so we're still kind of working on that. There are some platforms, so we're talking about kind of publishing and sharing data sets. There are some public archives, not a lot of them, that you can still go now, and instead of collecting your own data, you can kind of analyze existing archives. So there's one of the early, I was very excited when it came out, right at the end of term of President Obama in the US. Their team essentially published their social media posts across multiple platforms. So if you go to this public archive, essentially you see tweets not just by Obama, but also associated accounts with the White House, including other platforms like Instagram and others. So you can actually explore what they actually said, that you can search through it. My understanding that you can't really download it to do your own analysis, so that's a limitation, but the archive is there. The other archive I found interesting, it's an unofficial one though, that archives all of the tweets by Donald Trump, and it's been archiving it since before Trump became president, and you can kind of browse as well through this data set. I believe you can download tweets as well directly from that website, but that one is unofficial, and I'm not sure if Twitter will be happy knowing that it's there. There is also a Library of Congress initiative where they essentially partnered with Twitter, and Twitter was giving them access to Twitter data as a gift, and they were trying to figure out what is the digital platform to manage this overwhelming, massive amount of data. And from all of the indications, they were not as successful. And what happened essentially earlier this year, they said, well, we're no longer getting all of the tweets. It's just too much. We're gonna just switch to a very selective selection of tweets. So if we ever get access to that data set, as researchers, citizens, US citizens anyway, people will probably not get, will not have access full data set after 2018. Other initiatives, Internet Archives. So many of you, of course, familiar with Wayback Machine. You probably checked that out from many websites. It goes to a website, it captures how it looks, captures HTML page at a particular date when the system visited it, and then it archives it, and then does it on certain frequency. So what happens is they also do this type of snapshots for Twitter for some selective topics. I went to examine some of the available Twitter data sets there. And the scope is very limited, topic-wise, domain-wise, but also it's unclear how they sample those tweets, because essentially this web scraper goes to a page and it just grabs what's on the page. So it's very limited, and it's probably skewed towards whatever settings they had for that scraper. So not good for research, perhaps good for maybe for class discussions and exercise. There are recent data sets around kind of political ads. And again, it's emerged after the Cambridge Analytica scandal, after the 2016 US election, trying to understand who is influencing people's votes and what is the role of Facebook advertisement platform in all of that. So ProPublica actually has been developing this Firefox browser extension where they invite users, Facebook users, to install this extension, and the extension will kind of collect, with their consent, will collect this anonymized data on what advertisement is shown to them. And then it's then being aggregated in a single data set, and then this data set is currently available for any of you to analyze, essentially, to try to find relationship between the type of Facebook users and type of ads they've seen. It's available. It's great, but of course it's very kind of biased because only people who opt in, who selected to install that extension, their data will be there. So it's already biased in that way. But it's also very focused on these political ads. So if you're not studying political discussions and discourse, it's perhaps not quite relevant to you. Twitter, like I mentioned last week, released a couple of data sets related to political interference campaigns in the US. So I mentioned Russian accounts. They also have what they label as accounts associated with Iran. Sometimes it's unclear how they necessarily make those determinations. So we have to be cautious, again, what's in those data sets. And for me, the main question, what is not included. So they only share what they think what they think they know, but they might still miss quite a few accounts. And so Facebook also has been launching different programs, very focused on political discussions that perhaps allows you to some access to some data, but you have to apply, and it's very competitive, so it's not very accessible as a program to scholars. So as you can see, it's a very mixed landscape, and it's constantly changing. And I think with recent changes in terms of shutting down APIs and other ways to access data, we'll see few and few of this type of data sets out there. So we walk very quickly through different stages in the social media data stewardship framework, from collection to analysis to publishing and reusing social media data sets. But what I want to also emphasize today is that ethics should be an integral part of this process. So it should be part of each step individually. And there are very unique questions, ethical questions related to each of these steps. Based on the kind of literature, we know something about ethical expectations of researchers who engaged in social media research. I'll just quickly summarize here. So again, based on this is a kind of literature review article where they say research in this area considered to be more acceptable by social media users if it's going to a good cause, morally right, generally good for the public, or done by nonprofit or academic researchers. They also say that social media users care about data quality, accuracy, and representation. And there should be some special considerations when studying sensitive topics or vulnerable groups like minors, deceased, or topics like mental health. So I think we all can agree with these considerations, and we have to just keep reminding ourselves that even if we're working with publicly available social media data, these considerations should still apply. So meaning that even if you don't have to apply for research ethics board's approval for your research, you still have to be considerate and ethical researchers in that space. What's less known is about ethical considerations for third parties. And so this is the gap in the literature that we were trying to address in our work in the social media lab by asking Canadians, in this particular case, how they feel about third parties, like journalists, like governments, like border patrol agents, using their data, social media data, to make decisions and inferences about them. And here are some of the recent articles that came out where we examine essentially privacy paradox, when people are concerned about privacy, but it seems like they're not doing anything about it. In fact, it's not true. We actually did find that people perhaps behave they worry about privacy, but they don't necessarily worry to the extent to delete their account or stop using social media accounts, but they might change their behavior. They may post less. They may post less accurate information. And those are direct action that can influence the quality and accuracy of our analysis if you're relying on social media data. We also look at the journalistic use of social media data, but instead of going to journalists and asking about, well, how do you feel about it? What do you do with it? We'll again ask Canadians about how do you feel if journalists use your data. And there was interesting results because we did find there's small percentage of users were really uncomfortable with this practice, even when it comes to social media data. But we also found another percentage of users that said, well, we want to be heard, so yes, please quote us. So there's also mixed reaction from users themselves. We also ask how do you feel if a company that you apply for a job gonna check your social media accounts and whether that will make you less or more comfortable or not. Interestingly, regardless whether you're applying for work or not, you're still generally uncomfortable with this practice, and even if it comes to publicly available social media data. So there are some clear implications to firms that engage in this, what we call cyber vetting. So a little bit more details overall from this survey that these articles came out. Essentially, we asked Canadians about their social media use, and then we asked them, well, how do you feel? Are you comfortable if different agents use your social media data? And we have a big list of options like financial institutions, marketers, journalists, and so on. Then we ask how comfortable are you in relation to different types of your data being used, and from more kind of aggregated view to more refined views. And then we also differentiated users from uses. So for what purposes? Because the same organization can use your data for different purposes: credit check, insurance claims, public health monitoring, law enforcement, and so on. So these all examples actually came out from recent kind of news coverage of this event. So these are actually real things that happened and happening still. So for example, the banks can use your social media data to determine your credit score. Again, a real example. Security agencies use social media data to identify real and potential threats, especially location-based data. There was an example in the UK company, car insurance company. They used Facebook data, posts and likes, to price your car insurance rates. And supposedly, if you use too many exclamation marks, your insurance rate will go up. So watch out for that. And of course, the Cambridge Analytica scandal that we started this talk with, using Facebook user data and friends of a friends data for political targeted ads. And so all of these cases are happening. So we just try kind of to summarize it and ask Canadians about their experiences, but also their attitudes towards this practice. So here's the result. The percentage of our participants who are uncomfortable, and this is based on a national survey with 1,500 participants. So how comfortable would you be if one of the following entities access information about you or posted by you publicly on social media data? And so they were least uncomfortable with academic researchers, so it's still a good thing for us. 44% said they are to some degree uncomfortable, but still it's the smallest percentage on this scale. Then you have current employers, potential employers, customer and border protection officers, legal professionals, insurance companies, and it keeps going up. So they're most uncomfortable with political parties and marketers. And so interestingly, in Canada, we know political parties, they don't have certain specific legislation that governs their use of user data. But perhaps these results may suggest they probably should have something. Now, turning to data types, so from users to types. So we ask about different common data types that are available about us on social media. And sometimes what happens, essentially, we may think we know what data is available about us, but in reality, it's not the case. Why? Because platforms aggregate our interactions, our posts and comments and likes, and they create a profile, a digital profile around different users. So you might not even realize types of analytics that is available about you. So the least uncomfortable data type was posting frequency. Essentially, how many posts you've done over time. And it's somewhat kind of aggregated view. The reason we ask this question is because there's always discussion, what if your boss knows that you're tweeting during your work hours kind of situation? So it was 50-50. Some people were comfortable, some not comfortable. So perhaps 50% that were comfortable were coming from academia. But then we ask about sentiments. We know that a lot of analytics allows you to analyze and automatically determine positive, negative messages towards a particular subject matter. And again, about half were uncomfortable with that type of data being shared as well. Then we have activity level in the group. Essentially, the difference here, instead of your posting behavior individually, companies can see how active you are within a particular group. So are you just a lurker, just read comments, or you active participants? Then there are a lot of tools doing topic modeling. Some you presented yesterday. And now we fall into the category halfway through that participants were least comfortable with. So I'll start from the bottom. So bottom here, communication networks. So essentially, the networks and visualization of those networks that shows you in relationship to others, how you connected. Participants clearly felt it was very sensitive type of data. And of course, the pictures and other multimedia objects, they also felt very as a sensitive data. So essentially, this type of information kind of helps us to understand when we're developing ethical guidelines and considerations, that it's not just who is using data, but also what types of data they're using. And certainly having skills like this allows you to say what are the risks and concerns associated with a particular data type. All right, so I think we kind of look at the social media data stewardship, just to remind you, as a process of managing social media data from the point of collection to sharing. And what I emphasize today is the ethics has to be part of each step and decision making, and it's often different from different purposes and different data types. So I'll take away, summarize some of the points, and then I think we have some time for your questions, comments, and discussions. So the first kind of key takeaway here is that social media research ethics is not one-size-fits-all framework, as you can see from my examples, and that the privacy really varied across users, and data types. So we can't really say, oh, people don't care about privacy on Twitter, but they care about privacy on Facebook, which is really wrong way to say it. Yes, it's true that Twitter is a public platforms and most of the accounts public, but there still may be some privacy expectations, especially if we're working with sensitive topics and vulnerable groups. And same with Facebook. If you flip it kind of around, Facebook is primarily private platform, but there are lots of public pages and groups. There are lots of public figures who are engaged on Facebook. So we can't really say that everything's private on Facebook. There's no difference in privacy concerns when we ask about private versus public social media data, and that was some of the most interesting results for us. That you'd assume that if you have a public account, people will say, well, it's public, go mine it, do whatever you please. But it wasn't the case. So essentially, again, just to reiterate, if we are working with publicly social media data, we still have users may still have an expectation of privacy. And as a result of the expectation of privacy, they're not necessarily dropping out of social media and becoming less social. They might engage in what we call privacy protective behavior and responses, where they limit their engagement, or they might move towards more private platforms, or they just post less or inaccurate information. So those have direct implications to how we collect data and what results we derive from it. So before I conclude, since you're here, you're interested in social media research, I would like to invite you to join us next summer in Toronto for the next year's Social Media and Society Conference, where we'll continue many of these conversations. So submit some of your work to the conference in January. So thank you, and time for questions.
Merci à tous. Merci. Nous avons du temps pour les questions.
Thanks for the very informative talk. I have a question. I know you focused more specifically on data stewardship, but I had a question about publishing or dissemination of results. Do you know how users feel about, or people feel about them being quoted in papers, for example? I know I've had some discussions here with the ERIC Research Committee about that. They told me that well, the readers should not be able to trace back the user from the tweets, but it's not obvious how you can do that, or how, well, do you know something about that?
So the question, just for the mic, it was how do people feel about being quoted from social media accounts? And that's in the context of their public comments?
Yes.
Yeah, so the result is somewhat mixed. I'm just going to go back to the part where we asked them specifically about journalistic use of social media data, and we did ask about how do you feel if journalists quote you. And the challenge is that you have some people who are really uncomfortable with the practice, and some those who would want to be heard. Essentially, politically engaged citizens, for example, they want attribution to their messages. So that means that the best thing to do is to go back and ask users. But of course, sometimes it's impossible if it's anonymous account, or there are no means to directly interact with those accounts, so maybe they deleted the account. So if there's no way to really reconfirm they're comfortable with a quote. Certainly a safer way would be to paraphrase. But also going back to that sliding scale that I showed you, looking at the topics you studied, the groups you studied, perhaps if you study people who are public in their opinions and they want to be heard, maybe it's okay to keep a quote. So really case by case. But I think we have to also educate our research ethic boards a little bit and work with them to understand the challenges. And there's a tendency sometimes to do whatever the ethics boards tell us just to quickly get an approval. But I think it's a two-way street. We have to inform them as well. So thank you for this question.
Cecilie, you had a question?
I did, yeah. Thank you so much. I really appreciated your talk today. I wanted to specifically ask you about scraping, which is something that I've worked on in my own research. And I had two questions with relation to scraping. One was barrier to entry with scraping of social media. So sort of what are the ways in which that might be an issue with regard to trying to get large-scale amounts of web data. And then secondly, my question was related to cost of scraping if one does not have technical skills. Because an actual scrape of a full website, a dynamic scrape can cost up to 30,000 Canadian dollars. Of course, if you have programming abilities, you can do that on your own, but there's limitations to the ability to scrape dynamically over time. So I'm wondering if you could maybe address those 2 points. I'm very interested in scraping. I'd love to hear your thoughts.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So the question again for our online audience about web scraping and some of the, I guess, technical challenges associated, costs associated with doing that. So aside of the ethical concerns, there's still technical challenges like you described, because we are dealing with the data that is dynamic. There could be millions of, let's say, tweets posted to the website, so it would be challenging to scrape all of them anyway. The way I see it is that even with APIs, when you collect data from social media platforms directly through their protocols, you still have to deal with those challenges. You still have to turn to some of the big data infrastructures that allows you to store large quantity of data and process it. And so this challenge is still there, and for many social science and digital humanities researchers, still a challenge, either technical skills or access to this digital platform. So I still see kind of the challenge across. It doesn't matter how you get the access. But what I was trying to say is that if you don't have access at all through APIs, some may turn to web scraping, and you're right to point out that it may not be as technically easy. There are scripts though that allows you to do that, but again, we don't know how reliable in terms of coverage that those type of approaches will be. Yeah. Certainly, if you're scraping certain profiles, let's say Instagram profiles, and you're analyzing certain brands where they don't update content every second, so that may be more doable technically.
You mentioned toward the end of your talk that you and your collaborators found that there was no real difference in privacy concerns when folks were asked about private versus public social media data. That really surprised me. Can you speculate as to why that is? Talk a little bit more about that?
Well, I think because as we use social media data, it becomes part of our daily routine, daily lives. And sometimes we may not even think about whether we're on private part of the website or public part of the website. Sometimes we use multiple accounts. In our survey, for example, Canadians on average use 4 to 5 different social media accounts. And some of them may be primarily public, some primarily private. So because of that mix of accounts and mixed use and the integration of social media in our daily lives, I think that's what happened. That people, if they feel sensitive about this topic, if they're uncomfortable, they will be uncomfortable throughout their accounts.
Yeah, you just kind of started touching on what I was going to ask, which is the basis for ethical decisions based on user responses. I was struck by the kind of what seemed to me a rather narrow range between the low end and the high end of the percentage. But also what you're speaking to here is the kind of way in which people are acculturated into understanding their different concerns about privacy and publicity. So I wonder if you could just say a little bit more about using individual or collective responses to these concerns as a basis for ethical decisions in terms of research.
So just to summarize, the question is about, I guess, pointing out why there's a small range in terms of comfort level and whether it's, how challenging it is to study the concerns on this large scale, right?
Yeah,
the national scale.
Right. It seems part of the culture that social media is producing that people are willing to allow their data to be used. So I'm just curious about that as a basis for ethical decisions in terms of research.
It's a good question, and we're struggling with that as well. So what essentially we're doing, we're trying to look for a relationship between different study participants and their attributes, such as gender, age, profession, their use patterns, and their privacy concerns. Because the percentages I showed you, it's very kind of aggregated on a larger number, and you miss the opportunity to see the more granular picture. So certainly once we go deeper and we're still trying to analyze to do that, we're finding more interesting patterns. And so you're absolutely right. Sometimes it's because of the platform, but sometimes it's something about your previous experience. If you had privacy invasion in the past online, then you certainly will be more sensitive to that topic. And it does create a challenge to develop the kind of one ethical guideline for everyone. So I think as we talk more about different scenarios, researchers can develop their own guidelines in that regard. But it is challenging. Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, it's quite the same question, but formulated in another way. I mean, you are talking about data used by third parties, and actually, I'm wondering at what point we as users are aware of what we are doing with the second party. I mean, what are the privacy policies of the companies like Twitter or Google and so on? And I think that just a little experience when I talk about that to my students and I just read what they are giving to Google, they just say, no, I never did that. And so, I mean, there's something very interesting there because we say we are not comfortable about our employee looking at our public posts, but at the same time we are comfortable. We would not be comfortable if we knew what we were doing when checking in.
So essentially the question about digital literacy, information literacy, and how that may impact users' privacy concerns and behavior. So when we look at the privacy literature, a lot of it will end, an article will end, well, we need to do more information, we need to educate users, essentially. But in another study, I didn't present it on it today, we actually asked users about it, and in fact, we show them exactly what Facebook might derive from their own data. And we can clearly see their privacy concerns would go up. But for many, unfortunately, it stops at that point. So your privacy concerns go up, but you might not engage in any privacy protective behavior. And so we're trying to understand, why. So there's some kind of theoretical concepts to describe this behavior, perhaps as kind of notion of digital resignation, like I can't do much about it, but I still want to be engaged. So trying to get to that point. So I think to answer your question is that literacy is important, but it may not get you to changing somebody's behavior. And so you're right to say that we don't, users generally don't read terms of service. And what's more risky is that we don't, as social media users, don't realize what can be done without data in terms of analytics, what other insights can be derived. And so when we show that to users, they were surprised, like your students were, but it somehow didn't change their behavior. Still interesting.
Yeah, thank you. I want to push on that last question a little bit, because I was wondering a similar kind of thing, which is whether anybody was thinking about this ethical problem from a cultural policy perspective. Because like, we're not really talking about information literacy. What we're talking about, on the one hand, is contract law. So the expectations of the companies about what you're going to be doing with your data as researchers. But then there's also what Canadian intellectual property law or international intellectual property law treaties say about what you can do with this data, which is often wildly different from what the companies say you can do in contract law. So if we leave it at the level of the researchers educating the users, that whole kind of collective policy layer is completely ignored. So do you know, is anyone thinking about this from that perspective yet? Or like how does that tie into your thinking about the ethical?
So I think your question about what are the contractual obligations from the responsibilities from the company side, really good one, because if we know that education is only can get you so far, and we can really leave all these responsibilities on users themselves to protect themselves and decide what is possible or what is not. So certainly the companies and some policy should be put in place. The question is, there are people discussing it, but the question is, what shape and form should it take? And I think we need another hour or two for that discussion to happen. Yeah. But I agree with you. It cannot be just users who are responsible for their own privacy. And besides, when we're talking about Cambridge Analytica scandal, what happened is that the company accessed, the third-party application accessed friends of a friend's data. So it's not just about what you do with your data. So also now about what my friends share with somebody that I'm not aware. And as a result, my data is now part of somebody's data set. So certainly cases like that does show that companies have to be responsible and more transparent about their practices. So thank you for raising this issue.
Yeah, I was just going back to the Twitter archive that you mentioned at the Library of Congress, and I don't know, you saw they just had a call maybe a couple of weeks ago for fellowship for 2019, and listed all the things you could come and work on, and they actually said that you can't even access what they have right now, and I guess the question probably has come up in the past that they've specifically identified the fact that that archive is no longer available to be considered. So it's literally already off, sort of access. So not even just the 2018, but even the stuff that they have. So which brings up all the questions that you raised. But in case you didn't know that, I just wanted to flag it as already sort of taking place.
Yeah, I was aware of a program a couple of years ago where they had fellows directly, specifically coming to work with Twitter data sets, but it failed. For internal reasons, and sounds like they decided to be very front about it. Yeah. And it is a problem, and problem is a number of ways. Why? Because now there's this notion that, well, if Library of Congress cannot make tweets, cannot manage this large data set, like what we individual researchers or individual libraries or data archivists can do. And that's, I think, it creates that notion of resignation as well. But I think we might have other ways, more creative ways to handle a larger archive. So we can use that as an example that, well, it's impossible. All right. Thank you for the update. Well, maybe I'll turn it around and ask some of you, maybe some of you working with these data sets, how you handle maybe questions and issues around data sharing and data reuse. Do you see an innovative, maybe potential solutions to that problem? Well, the silent tells me that all of us should be putting together a grant application for sure next year to handle this problem, because it's still open question. So if you're interested in grant application, keep in touch. Let me know.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you.
Nous avons maintenant une pause café.